see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney+. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet.
Yeah! Go, 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 go!
A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney+.
It will be an adventure for the whole family.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
Whitby is a town where the past never feels entirely different. The North Sea presses constantly against its shoreline. The harbour divides the old town in two. Above everything stand the ruins of Whitby Abbey, exposed to the centuries of wind and weather, watching over the rooftops below, much as they have for hundreds of years.
Blowing ad budget on metrics that look great till the CFO sees them, that's bull spend. And marketers are calling it out in Dashboard Confessions.
I remember telling my boss, it'll be good for the brand, when leads were slow. Yeah, it wasn't.
Cut the bull spend. LinkedIn lets you target by company, job title, and more. Advertise on LinkedIn. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a $250 credit. Go to linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
It is a place that attracts visitors for many reasons. Some come for the history, some for the coastline, and some because Whitby has acquired a reputation as one of the most atmospheric towns in Britain. Yet among the abbey ruins, old churchyards and narrow streets stands a lesser-known survivor from another age. A Tudor house that has watched Whitby change for more than 5 centuries. A house known as Bagdale Hall. To understand why such a building has become associated with ghost stories, it helps to begin with the landscape itself. Whitby occupies a natural harbour at the mouth of the River Esk on the North Yorkshire coast. Long before the town existed, people were living and travelling through this landscape. Archaeological discoveries throughout the Esk Valley and the surrounding moorlands have revealed evidence of prehistoric activity, stretching back thousands of years. Flint tools, ancient field systems, and burial monuments all point towards a landscape that has been used, worked, and inhabited since long before recorded history. The sea shaped everything. It provided food, transport, and trade. It connected communities that would otherwise remain isolated. The river allowed access inland, while the natural harbour offered shelter from the often hostile conditions of the North Sea. The location was valuable long before Whitby acquired its modern name. The first clear chapter of Whitby's recorded history begins during the Anglo-Saxon period. Around 657 AD, a monastery was established on the headland, overlooking the harbour. The community was led by Hild, later known as Saint Hilda, one of the most important religious figures in early English history. Born into Northumbrian royalty, Hilda became renowned for her wisdom and leadership. Contemporary writers described kings seeking her advice and churchmen respecting her judgment. Under her guidance, the monastery grew into one of the most influential religious centres in the Kingdom of Northumbria. It was here, in 664 AD, that the Synod of Whitby took place. The meeting brought together church leaders to resolve differences between Celtic and Roman Christian practices. While the details of the debate may seem remote today, the decision helped shape the future direction of Christianity in England. It was one of the defining moments in early English religious history, and it took place on the cliffs above the town. Little survives above ground from Hilda's original monastery. The structures visible today belong largely to later centuries, yet archaeology has gradually revealed fragments of that lost Saxon world. Excavations around the abbey have uncovered evidence of early occupation, burials and structural remains associated with the monastic settlement. Over decades of investigation, archaeologists have built a clearer picture of life on the headland during one of the most important periods of early English history. The archaeology has also helped preserve one of Whitby's oldest legends. According to local folklore, Saint Hilda was confronted by a plague of snakes that infested the cliffs and surrounding countryside. Unable to rid the area of them by ordinary means, she prayed for assistance, and the snakes were turned to stone. The proof, people said, could still be found scattered along the shoreline. Those stones were ammonites. Today, we know they are fossils left behind by marine creatures that lived millions of years before humans appeared. Yet for centuries, they were regarded as evidence of the miracle. Local craftsmen even carved snake-like heads onto some specimens before selling them to visitors. The result was one of England's most enduring pieces of folklore, where geology and legend became inseparable. The monastery, established by Hilda, did not survive unchanged. During the 9th century, Viking raids affected much of the Northumbrian coast, and the monastic community eventually disappeared. For generations, the headland remained largely abandoned. Then, following the Norman conquest, a new religious foundation emerged among the ruins of the old. The Benedictine Abbey that followed would dominate Whitby for centuries. Construction took place over several hundred years, producing the great Gothic complex whose ruins remain today. Archaeological investigation has revealed successive phases of rebuilding, expansion and alteration. Beneath the standing walls lie traces of earlier structures and evidence of continual development. Like many medieval religious sites, the abbey was never static. It evolved as the needs and fortunes of the community changed. For centuries, the abbey was far more than a religious institution. It controlled land, employed local people, influenced trade, and played a central role in the daily life of the region. The monastery became one of the most important centres on the Yorkshire coast. Then came the 16th century. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, Whitby Abbey was closed and its lands seized by the Crown. The monks departed. The buildings were abandoned. Slowly, the vast complex began to deteriorate. Stone was removed, roofs collapsed, walls crumbled. The process took generations, but eventually the abbey became the romantic ruin recognised today. Yet if the abbey lost its religious purpose, it gained something else: stories. One of the oldest concerns the abbey bells. According to local folklore, valuable bells were removed following the dissolution and loaded aboard a ship bound for another destination. Before completing the journey, the vessel was lost at sea. The bells vanished beneath the water. That might have been the end of the story, but local tradition tells a different tale. For generations, people claimed that during storms, when waves battered the coastline and the wind roared across the cliffs, the bells could still be heard, ringing beneath the sea. There is no historical evidence that such sounds were ever heard. The story belongs firmly within the realm of folklore, yet it has survived for centuries, because it feels perfectly suited to Whitby, a town where the sea has always shaped local life, and where history and legend have often become intertwined. By the early 16th century, another chapter in Whitby's history was beginning. While the abbey still stood above the harbour, prosperous merchants were establishing themselves within the town below. Trade was growing. Ships arrived carrying goods from around the British coast and beyond. Whitby was becoming increasingly important as a working port. It was during this period, around 1516, that Bagdale Hall was built. Unlike the Abbey, Bagdale Hall was never intended as a place of worship. It was a domestic building, constructed as the residence of a wealthy merchant family. Architectural studies suggest that significant elements of its original timber-framed Tudor structure survive today, despite centuries of alteration and expansion. The house changed with the town. Rooms were modified, extensions were added. Generations came and went, yet the building remained occupied throughout much of its history, and that continuity matters. Old houses often acquire stories simply because they have witnessed so much. Births, deaths, celebrations, arguments, successes and failures all pass through the same walls. Few buildings survive for 500 years without accumulating memories. For most of its existence, Bagdale Hall appears in the historical record simply as a house. A substantial and important house, certainly, but still a practical building tied to the commercial life of the town. Its ghost stories would come much later, and when they did, they would become associated with a man whose life reflected the dangers, loyalties, and uncertainties of 17th century England. A man named Browne Bushell. His story begins not with ghosts, but with war, politics, and the sea. By the middle of the 17th century, Whitby was a very different place from the monastic settlement founded by Saint Hilda. The abbey still dominated the skyline, although its influence had begun to fade. Trade and shipping increasingly shaped the town's fortunes. The harbour bustled with activity as vessels arrived from ports around Britain and beyond. Merchants prospered, ship owners accumulated wealth. The sea provided opportunity, but it also brought danger. Storms, shipwrecks, and war were accepted realities of life along the Yorkshire coastline. But it was within this uncertain world that Browne Bushell lived. Like many figures from the English Civil War period, his story is complicated. Different accounts emphasise different aspects of his life, and over the centuries, fact has become intertwined with local legend. What appears reasonably clear is that Bushell was involved in maritime affairs during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. He served at sea, changed loyalties during the Civil War, and eventually found himself accused of piracy. In 1651, he was executed at Tower Hill in London. His death was real. The stories that followed belong to a different category entirely. At some point, long after his execution, Browne Bushell became associated with Bagdale Hall. Exactly how this connection developed is uncertain. No surviving records explain when people first began linking his name to the house. Like many ghost traditions, the story seems to have emerged gradually, becoming stronger with each retelling, until it became part of the building's identity. Today, if Bagdale Hall is known beyond Whitby itself, it is usually because of the stories attached to Bushell's alleged ghost. The most frequently repeated account concerns the staircase. Several members of staff have reported seeing a man descending the stairs within the building. What makes these stories interesting is that the figure is not generally described as transparent, mist-like, or obviously supernatural. Witnesses often describe seeing what appears to be an ordinary person. The impression is of someone moving naturally through the house, as though they belonged there. Only afterwards does the encounter become unusual. One of the best-known reports concerns a housekeeper working within the building. According to the story, she saw a man on the staircase and assumed he was a guest. There was nothing particularly alarming about the sighting at the time. It was only later when she realised that nobody matching the description should have been present, and she began to question what she had seen. Sometime afterwards, she was shown a portrait of Browne Bushell. She reportedly identified the face as that of the man she'd encountered. As with all retrospective identifications, caution is necessary. Human memory is far from perfect, and it is impossible to know how much time passed between the sighting and the identification. Nevertheless, the account remains one of the most frequently repeated stories associated with the hall. Whether one accepts the identification or not, the staircase itself appears again and again in reports connected with the building. Even when no figure is seen, people have spoken of hearing footsteps. Staff working alone have described hearing someone apparently moving through the upper floors. The sounds are often repeated as deliberate and measured, rather than vague creaks or settling noises. Witnesses describe hearing footsteps approaching, crossing a landing, or moving on the staircase, only to find nobody there when they investigate. Old buildings make noises. Any historic property will creak, settle, and shift as temperatures change. Timber expands and contracts. Floorboards respond to movement elsewhere in the structure. Such explanations must always be considered first. Yet those familiar with Bagdale Hall often distinguish between the ordinary sounds of the building and these reported footsteps. Whether that distinction reflects something genuinely unusual or simply the way people interpret familiar surroundings remains impossible to determine. The reports themselves, however, have persisted for decades. Another recurring feature of Bagdale Hall's reputation involves the voices of children. Accounts vary, but several describe hearing laughter, conversation, or the sound of children playing in areas where no children were present. Unlike the stories connected to Browne Bushell, these reports have no obvious historical figure attached to them. No specific event explains them. No documented tragedy links children to the building. The voices simply appear as a reoccurring element within the wider body of reports. Visitors have occasionally contributed similar stories. A room that sounded occupied, despite being empty. A voice heard briefly from another part of the building. The impression that someone had just passed through a corridor moments before arriving there. Individually, such experiences prove very little. Collectively, they have helped shape the reputation of the hall. The most dramatic reports associated with Bagdale Hall involve objects apparently moving without explanation. One story tells of cups being overturned when no obvious cause could be identified. Another concerns an ashtray. This was reportedly seen moving from one position before landing elsewhere in the room. These accounts should be treated carefully. Unlike the staircase sightings, which have been repeated by multiple sources over many years, details surrounding the object movement stories are often vague. Dates are rarely given. Witness statements are difficult to trace. Most survive through repeated tellings rather than contemporary documentation. For that reason, they are best regarded as part of the building's folklore rather than strong evidence of paranormal activity. Yet even here, a pattern emerges. The stories attached to Bagdale Hall are generally subtle. There are no tales of violent hauntings, no report of attacks, no elaborate supernatural narratives. Instead, there are small incidents that leave witnesses puzzled rather than terrified. A figure on the staircase, footsteps in an empty building, children heard but not seen, objects that appear not to be where they should be. Perhaps that restraint is one reason the stories have endured. They feel closer to ordinary experience than many of the more sensational hauntings attached to historic buildings. Yet Bagdale Hall is only one part of Whitby's supernatural landscape. Above the town, The ruins of Whitby Abbey have attracted stories for centuries. The abbey hardly requires embellishment. Even in daylight, the site possesses a remarkable atmosphere. The vast Gothic arches rise above the cliffs. The North Sea stretches away beyond them. Wind moves constantly through the broken stonework. It is a place that encourages reflection, regardless of whether one believes in ghosts. Over time, however, the ruins accumulated their own traditions. Among the oldest is the story of the White Lady. Descriptions vary considerably. Some place the figure among the ruins themselves. Others locate her near the cliff edge overlooking the sea. Most accounts describe a pale female figure appearing briefly before vanishing. The inconsistency of the reports suggests that this is best understood as folklore rather than a single documented haunting. The White Lady belongs to a wider tradition found throughout Britain, where ruined buildings frequently acquire stories of pale female apparitions linked to tragedy, loss, or forgotten history. Whitby's version appears to have developed gradually over many years. Another figure sometimes associated with the abbey is Constance de Beverley. Unlike the White Lady, Constance did not originate in local history. She first appeared in Sir Walter Scott's poem Marmion, published in 1808. The character is a fictional nun who suffers punishment after breaking her vows. The poem became enormously popular during the 19th century, and eventually some visitors began treating Constance as though she had been a real historical figure connected to Whitby. Stories followed. Before long, people were claiming that her ghost could be seen among the abbey ruins. Historically, there is no evidence that Constance ever existed. Her importance lies not in whether she was real, but in how effectively literature can become folklore. Whitby would experience this process again on a much larger scale before the century was over. The abbey has also attracted reports of unexplained voices and distant chanting. Such stories appear repeatedly in local folklore collections and ghost guides, although reliable witness accounts are often difficult to trace. Most should be regarded as tradition rather than evidence. Still, they reveal something important about the way people experience the site. The abbey is a place where imagination naturally fills the gaps left by history. A ruined monastery standing above the sea was always likely to accumulate stories, and few places in England possess a setting better suited to them. Not far from the abbey stands another of Whitby's most recognisable landmarks. The Church of St Mary rises above the harbour on the east cliff, reached by the famous 199 steps that climb from the old town below. Visitors making the ascent today are rewarded with one of the finest views in Yorkshire. The harbour stretches out towards the North Sea. The rooftops of Whitby spread beneath the churchyard. Across the river, the west cliff rises beyond the town. It is a beautiful view. It is also one that has inspired stories for generations. The steps themselves have become part of local folklore. For centuries, funeral processions made the long climb towards St Mary's. Coffins were carried up from the town below. Families followed behind. The journey became a familiar part of life and death in Whitby. Perhaps because of that history, stories eventually attach themselves to the route. Some visitors have reported hearing footsteps ahead of them when nobody could be seen on the staircase. Others have spoken of seeing figures near the top of the climb that seemed to vanish before they could be reached. These stories are difficult to verify and should be regarded as reported experiences rather than established fact. Yet they have become part of the folklore surrounding one of Whitby's most famous locations. The churchyard itself has generated similar accounts. Many visitors describe an unusual atmosphere among the gravestones, although that alone proves very little. Historic graveyards often encourage reflection, particularly when they occupy dramatic landscapes. More interesting are the occasional reports of figures seen among the monuments. Typically the stories are brief. Someone notices a person standing among the stones. A movement catches the eye. Attention shifts for a moment. Then the figure is gone. The details vary from account to account, but the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Whether these experiences represent misidentification, expectation, coincidence, or something less easily explained, is impossible to determine. What matters is that the stories continue to be told. And nowhere in Whitby do history, atmosphere, and storytelling come together more completely than in the churchyard of St Mary's. It was here in the late summer of 1890 that a visitor found inspiration for one of the most influential horror novels ever written. His name was Bram Stoker. When Stoker arrived in Whitby, he found a town already rich in history and folklore. The abbey ruins dominated the skyline. The churchyard overlooked the sea. Ancient stories survived among local people. Shipwrecks, storms, and maritime traditions formed part of everyday life. He absorbed it all. Research notes made during his stay revealed just how much Whitby influenced his imagination. He spent time studying local history and exploring the town. The landscape left a lasting impression. Years later, that impression would emerge in the pages of Dracula. Few places are strongly associated with a work of fiction. The abbey appears, the churchyard appears, the harbour appears. Even the atmosphere of the town itself seems woven throughout the novel. One of the most famous scenes concerns the arrival of Dracula in England aboard the Demeter. The vessel enters Whitby during a violent storm. When it finally runs aground, the crew are dead. The captain remains tied to the wheel. As people gather around the wreck, a large black dog leaps ashore and disappears into the darkness. The scene is entirely fictional, yet over time it became inseparable from Whitby itself. Visitors arrived searching for the locations described in the novel. Stories connected to Dracula became absorbed into the town's identity. What had begun as literature gradually evolved into a modern form of folklore. That process is perhaps most visible in the story of the Black Dog. Long before Dracula was written, Black Dog legends existed throughout Yorkshire and much of Britain. Reports varied, but the image remained familiar. A large, dark animal appearing unexpectedly on lonely roads, coastal paths, or churchyard boundaries. Sometimes regarded as an omen, sometimes a guardian, sometimes simply unexplained. Following the publication of Dracula, many visitors naturally linked Whitby's Black Dog traditions to the creature from Stoker's novel. The two stories merged. Today, it is often difficult to separate the older folklore from the literary influence that followed. Yet Whitby's supernatural reputation extends far beyond Dracula. The sea itself generated countless stories. For centuries, the town depended upon maritime trading and fishing. Ships sailed regularly from the harbour. Whaling expeditions left for Arctic waters. Merchant vessels connected Whitby with ports around Britain and beyond. The sea brought prosperity. It also brought loss. Storms claimed vessels with little warning. Sailors disappeared. families waited for news that sometimes never arrived. Out of those realities emerged many of the ghost stories common to coastal communities. One recurring tradition concerns sailors appearing briefly to relatives before news of their deaths arrived. Such stories can be found throughout Britain's maritime history, and Whitby possesses its share of them. A wife sees her husband standing momentarily in a doorway, despite knowing he is at sea. A family member experiences a vivid dream shortly before receiving confirmation of a loss. Whether viewed as coincidence, grief, or something more mysterious, these stories reveal the emotional reality of life in a seafaring community. Other maritime traditions belong more clearly to folklore. Stories speak of figures seen walking the harbour walls late at night, before vanishing into mist. Unidentified sailors appearing briefly near the docks. Lantern lights seen offshore, where no vessel could later be found. Most of these tales were impossible to trace to specific witnesses. Many likely evolved through retelling. Yet they survive because they fit the landscape so naturally. Anyone who has stood beside the sea at night understands why. Fog can transform familiar surroundings beyond recognition. Lights appear distorted across water. Sounds travel unexpectedly. Distances become difficult to judge. The coast has always encouraged imagination. That imagination extends to some of Whitby's oldest legends. In recent decades, Whitby has become associated with another tradition altogether. Twice each year, thousands of visitors arrive for Whitby Goth Weekend. What began in 1994 as a relatively small gathering has grown into one of the best-known Gothic festivals in the world. Visitors travel from across Britain and beyond. Victorian-inspired clothing fills the streets. The Abbey and Churchyard become backdrops for photographs. Music, literature, history, and alternative culture combine in a celebration unlike anything else in the country. To an outsider, the event may seem unusual, yet it feels perfectly at home in Whitby. The festival did not create the town's Gothic reputation. It grew from it. The Abbey ruins, the Dracula connection, the folklore, the atmosphere. All of these existed long before the first Goth Weekend. In many ways, the festival represents the latest chapter in a story that began more than 1300 years ago, with Saint Hilda's monastery on the headland. Each generation has viewed Whitby differently. The Saxons saw a place of faith. The medieval monks saw a religious community. The Victorians saw romantic ruins. Bram Stoker saw inspiration. Modern visitors see history, folklore, and Gothic culture existing side by side. Yet beneath all these interpretations, the town itself remains remarkably unchanged. The sea still crashes against the cliffs. The Abbey still dominates the skyline. The churchyard still overlooks the harbour. And Bagdale Hall still stands quietly within the old town. Its reported footsteps, its staircase apparition, its children's voices, none exist in isolation. They belong to a wider landscape where history and folklore have become intertwined over centuries. Whether ghosts exist is a question every listener must answer for themselves. Whitby offers no definitive answers. What it does offer is something perhaps more interesting. A place where archaeology, documented history, literature, folklore, and personal experience all meet. A place where stories have accumulated layer upon layer until they have become part of the landscape itself. Perhaps that is why Whitby continues to fascinate people from around the world. Not because of any single ghost story, not because of Dracula, not because of the Goth Weekend, but because all these things combine to create a town unlike any other. A town where the past never feels entirely gone, and where even now, standing among the gravestones above the sea, or looking up at the ruins of the Abbey against the darkening sky, it is easy to understand why so many stories began here. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the podcast and get access to MP3s at buymeacoffee.com/Ghost Tales. They are £1.50 each, or free if you're a member. You can find everything at ghosttales.co.uk and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Ghost Tales Podcast.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.